This is lesson 17, types of democracy. After this lesson, most importantly, you should be able to compare and contrast the American congressional system with the Canadian parliamentary system. You should also be able to talk about some general democratic principles, and that's where we're going to get started. We have some notes in here for you that take you back to direct democracy in ancient Athens. This is important for you in terms of our writing assignments. There'll be opportunities for you to talk about the different types of democracy that we have, and this is important as we try to really fine-tune what is the best government approach. We also have some link to Plato here. Plato would be one of those individuals in our cast of characters that you can refer to. His concept of philosopher kings might be an interesting solution to some of your problems that you see with government. Our reference here to Six Nations and the Iroquois Confederacy does pop up on the multiple choice as we end up being tested about the origin of our representative system and the inspiration behind that coming from the Iroquois Confederacy. We also have a nice list here of principles of democratic systems, beginning with accountability. Accountability is one of those topics that you should be prepared to write an essay on. And not only should you be prepared to talk about the necessity of accountability, but you should be able to prescribe methods of accountability. And you should also be able to discuss what happens when those methods fail. So if you can only speak of elections and voting as the way that the will of the people can be expressed, then what do we do when elections are corrupted? What is our next step of accountability in order to preserve legitimacy of government? Separation of power is a concept that comes up a lot in multiple choice as we end up looking at the U.S. system and its clear separation of power between the three branches of government as outlined here for you. And one of the concerns that people have with the Canadian system is the lack of checks and balances and the overlap when individuals like our Prime Minister is the most important person of two of those branches and helps decide on who sits in that third branch. So when we compare the two systems, when we look at the Canadian system, it's important to look at separation of power and the ability of a Prime Minister to become more tyrannical. Definitely it's important to talk about the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and compare and contrast it with the U.S. Bill of Rights. When I read an essay that's in that E level, they don't talk about individual rights and freedoms generally. They talk about them specifically, and they become sophisticated when they can talk about individual rights and freedoms, like the First Amendment in the United States, the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, freedom of petition and assembly and worship, and they can apply it to scenarios when the government is and is not reasonable in their limits of it. They also talk about the Fourth Amendment, our privacy from government, and how the U.S. Bill of Rights Fourth Amendment has been violated to some extent through the USA Patriot Act. And the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the preamble has that description of reasonable limits in a free and democratic society. And it's that kind of language that if you can connect the nuances of the sources to those specific documents, it'll be to your benefit. In the multiple choice, it's very common to see some sources that test you on your understanding of the two electoral systems, first past the post versus proportional representation. So we have some notes here for you for that. And we'll also be studying the concept of suffrage. One of the concerns that we have with democracy is that we are seeing the will of the people being ignored at the expense of democracy itself. And one of the voices that is overpowering the will of the people is the will of corporations and lobby groups. And there's a nice article about political loyalty there. There's a cartoon that is suggesting that in order to do business in Ontario, you have to lobby the government, showing some corruption there for sure. We have lots of cartoons that kind of follow that same kind of idea. Each of these cartoons is an opportunity for you to stop, take a look, and test your A1 skills. Can you see within the cartoon a problem that is being exposed in society? And then how does that problem relate to liberalism? How does that problem relate to either the evolution of liberalism or the sustainability or viability of liberalism? How does it connect to the nature of mankind? And how does it connect to our relationship with each other and to our government? Look for an ideological perspective, which could be a solution to the problem. Think about What are the values that the ideological perspective is promoting? But what are the assumptions that it's making? Could there be some evidence that would further the ideological perspective, that would prove that it has been proven correct? Or is there some evidence that could be used to show that there are some assumptions and biases that the source is based on that, in hindsight, have proven to be illogical? Within this division of society, also explore the significance. Why do we need to understand a solution to this problem? What will happen if this problem goes unaddressed? Looking at the key building blocks of the problem, connect the problem to liberalism. Connect it to those principles from page 71 to 85 of the textbook. We need to be able to do this. And do use these cartoons as practice for that. Because there's lots in here. Some of the cartoons will have other literary devices like shading, or there might be personification or irony. There might be an allusion to something. It might be an allegory. There's lots of other things happening too. What's the context? Try to discover the context. Think of related words like universal suffrage or suffragettes. Think about individual people, and that'll help you with your A1 source breakdown. Another topic that we look at is dissent and disobedience and the limits of dissent and disobedience. When should dissent be allowed and when should dissent be overruled? When is it reasonable for the government to silence people? When is it unreasonable? When is it not reasonable? And ultimately, in terms of this, this conflict between man and environment and man and our government, connect it back to liberalism, connect it back to individualism and collectivism. So you should be able to create a chart comparing the parliamentary system with the congressional system and looking at the key values of both, but also the flaws of both and seeing if you can come up with some solutions. The chart here shows the Canadian House of Commons, and we don't need you to memorize the seating charts. It's not Social 9, but we want you to be able to look into the Canadian system and see how accountability and opposition are built into the fabric of Canada's House of Commons, but at the same time, how is there room for reform? One of the most confusing things about the US system is the Electoral College. How do you have President Trump when Hillary Clinton beat him in the election? How do we have President George W. Bush when Al Gore beat him in that election? How come the popular vote isn't just the deciding vote? Well, the United States of America is the United States, plural, of America, and they wanted to ensure that smaller states like Maine and Nebraska were guaranteed a minimal number of seats in the Electoral College. Because of that, there is a distortion of the will of the people. Now, in terms of accountability, another concept that you might want to think about is how can we hold the government accountable in between elections? Things like impeachment and recall could be important to talk about. Now, we do take the notes that we just established and we do allow you to go into more detail here. Now, I have my chapter 10 notes here, and I also give you my chapter 11 notes as well. These notes are here so that you can see, what should chapter notes look like? I have the page references in the textbook as well. Now, I've done it for chapter 10 and 11 because they're the two key chapters in the political unit. I think you need to take notes like this in the other chapters, especially chapters 4, 5, and 6. Some of the key concepts that you could go into more depth with are checks and balances. There's a 4-minute TED Talk on that. There's a nice editorial here as well, some language that you should read through. See if you can understand unpacking the language. If not, bring it up during our hangout. There's a cartoon about Trump. Again, try out your skills. There's a great little cartoon about debt. Now, unfortunately, the debt crisis of $20 trillion has grown, and therefore the monster keeps getting bigger, and the child keeps getting more vulnerable. Looking at the fear in the U.S. system, a TED Talk of 18 minutes might be a nice tangential thing to look at. Maybe it shouldn't be pink as a necessary thing, but maybe a little off pink there. We also have the Canadian system and a 3-minute review of the Canadian system. And our key concept is that responsible government that unfortunately has meant that instead of being responsible to the will of people, we end up having a system where cabinet and party solidarity outweighs the will of the people. So I do have a Prezi here for you that should be your last step going through Canada. It's going to go through Canada in great detail. It's going to look at the different electoral systems, the one that Canada uses, the one that most European countries use. It's going to talk about the pros and cons of those. And it's going to contrast Canada with the United States here a little bit as well. So some additional notes to push you over the top and get you closer to 80%. Here's a great article on the Canadian system and some of the reforms that could be made to make it great. And again, that's the key to the writing assignments. Not only knowing what it is, but what it could be. And how can we change it to make it better? Knowing what it is 60%. That's straightforward. That's the province. You need to be able to take what's there and really analyze it and critically respond to it and say, how can we make it better given certain circumstances? That's an application of knowledge and just not a repetition of knowledge. But I look forward to hearing from you in our Hangout.